we're doing today is we're starting to get right into statistical inference. So I want to say a few general things about where that fits in the scheme of things before we get into some of the details. We have by now, and this was largely confirmed by the second test, most students have got a pretty good idea of how measurement works, a reasonable grasp of the principles of exploratory data analysis. There were some really good tests. There were very few that I would say were dire. And there were a number where the performance was a bit uneven. The student was very good at some things and kind of missed on other things. One of the patchier areas was the understanding of the difference between ordinal measurement and interval measurement. But I'll come back to that. In fact, if I have time today, I might say a few words about that. But on the whole, I was pretty happy with the test. So we're in a reasonable position to move on now. I did say at the beginning of the course, that I talked on the first lecture a little bit about this idea of threshold concepts, the idea that there are some concepts that really just take a while to settle in to your way of thinking. Most people just don't grasp them immediately, and it can take quite a bit of work to get to them. And some of these measurement related concepts fall into that category. The real tricky one with measurement is this kind of slightly grey area between ordinal measurement and interval level measurement. But we'll explore that further to try and help reinforce the idea. Now, we're now coming into the next big threshold concept, which is about statistical inference. And statistical inference is probably the biggest single threshold concept in data analysis and the use of data as evidence for decision making. And like a lot of these threshold concepts, it looks kind of simple when you first describe it, but it seems to still take quite a while for people to get it, and it's not easy. And I think we'll see that as we go. The part that's not easy is not calculations. We will be doing some calculations, but I think you'll see that in the scheme of things, they're not really very complicated calculations. When you learn about statistical inference in a traditional statistics course, typically what happens is at the same time you're trying to learn about statistical inference, you're trying to grasp this difficult threshold concept, and at the same time you're learning a whole lot of calculations and things you have to check for different types of tests and how to use a computer to do them and so on. So it becomes quite overwhelming for a lot of people. And what often happens is they kind of get through the statistics course by learning how to do the calculations and learning how to do the stuff on the computer, but they get to the end of it and they never really quite internalize statistical inference. I'd like this to sort of work in the opposite direction in this course. And one advantage for that is if you haven't done a statistics course and you go on and do one, hopefully you will come prepared already having a pretty good grasp of what statistical inference is. So what we're going to do in this topic, and this will really extend over this week and next week, we're going to work through some examples today and introduce a few techniques. So what we want to do is we want to develop intuitions about populations and samples. This is actually, in some ways, one of the hardest things about this statistical inference idea, is really getting a handle on what populations and samples are. It's not as simple as it might seem at first blush. Today we're going to show you how to make what we call point estimates of medians with confidence intervals. So that's how to take a sample from some population and doing a calculation, come up with a confidence interval for the value of that median in the population, not in the sample, but in the population. And we're also going to look at some ways of testing for the difference in the medians of samples taken from two different populations. And once you've got those ideas down, you've actually got what you need to do to make judgments about certain types of evidence in certain situations, including some fairly common types of experimental situations. So you'll have enough. You'll have a very basic toolkit that you could use for actual experiments in a business context. When you get into, if you're trying to do scientific research, things start to become quite a bit more complicated typically, although frankly quite a lot of scientific research could be done with these very basic techniques anyway. Next week, so today we're just going to be looking at medians and differences in medians. Next week we're going to look at proportions. The principles are pretty much exactly the same with proportions. What's different is the calculations. The formula for proportions, well, there's two formulas. They're a little bit more complicated than the one for medians, but otherwise it's pretty much the same deal.